Hey folks, Sean here, and what I want to talk to you about in this video are the economics of product development. Now, as a B2B SaaS consultant, I work with a lot of clients helping them get a better return out of their investment into product development. And one of the questions I often ask early clients in our engagement is, what type of return are you receiving from any investment you're making into product development? To which I usually either don't get an answer or get a I don't know. But that's a good question and we should answer it, right? I totally agree. Now, the reason why I feel this is so important is because the vast majority of the dollars invested into product development does not produce a return. In fact, most of the time, it is lost entirely and makes the product experience worse. Now, I'm going to go into that in greater detail, but because this is such a problem, that's why I want to focus on that in this video to figure out perhaps where you are with your product development efforts and how to get a better return from any investment there. First, I want to talk to you about how I know that the vast majority of investment into product development is wasted. This is a feature adoption report that comes from a company called Pendo, and in it they talk about ultimately how much is wasted that it gets invested into product development. If you see from some of these statistics, nearly 80% of which features are shipped into various products, B2B SaaS included, ultimately are either never or very rarely used, meaning to me that 80% of those efforts that go into product development essentially are wasted. And as you could tell, this leads to a significant amount of financial loss. Upwards of $30 billion of product development effort is essentially wasted. The thing that isn't really mentioned in this report, which I think is another big and problematic component to this, is if you are shipping 4 out of 5 features that are rarely or never used, that means for the people that are using your product, that you're making a mess of the product experience because you continue to provide them 80% of the time with features that they don't want or are not going to use. That's going to make over time your product borderline unusable because you're not providing them with the value that they ultimately need. So you could theoretically remove 4 out of 5 features from your product and make the experience considerably better, but largely barely, if at all, change the usage statistics on it as well. That would make your product experience significantly better. So those are real numbers that are very expensive and create just an absolute mess of your product experience. So this is a really important area that I focus in because I believe it's the area where you can make the biggest impact in your product development efforts from an investment perspective. Now, when we're talking about companies that are trying to get a better return in areas like this or perform better from a financial perspective, you hear a lot about statistics like LTV, CAC, so lifetime value of a customer acquisition cost, ARR, MRR, metrics like these from a financial perspective. And while I agree, those are important in terms of evaluating financially how the business is ultimately doing, what is often missed, and I think is a huge missed opportunity, is this investment into product development and how well that's performing. Now, the analogy that I'm going to provide you with is, it's like if you're in a boat or in a ship and you're trying to get from where you are to where you want to go. So you've got a source location and you've got a destination location, right? But now most of the effort is focused on how fast you can go and whether or not you're going in the right direction and all that kind of stuff. And I get that. I'm not saying those aren't important, but what I am saying is a missed opportunity is the fact that your boat is likely taking on water. That's what the analogy is in this equation, as in if the vast majority of the features that you are shipping and providing into your product experience are not making the experience better, they are actually making it worse, which is slowing the progress down considerably. And just like a boat that's taking on water, it's increasing the likelihood that you might potentially sink. Okay, so now that we know what some of the problems and in particular the impact is here, if you're not receiving a solid return on product development investment and you're making your product experience worse, I want to talk about how you can get started with ultimately fixing it. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to get a better understanding of where you are today. Now, this visual, what it's providing you with is really just kind of an idea of what most product development organizations are doing. They're just constantly shipping things. And that's akin to basically that boat just constantly taking on water. You can't focus on like plugging the hole or get the water out of the boat or stop from taking on water because you're just constantly adding more new to the boat, making your problem worse. So most organizations are facing a situation like this. But what I want to be able to answer for your product development organization is ultimately what features are your customers using? How often are they using those certain features? What kind of value are they getting from the features that you have provided them with? How much time or cost is ultimately being saved by the features they are using? And then ultimately what type of return your customers are getting as well too. I really want you to be able to answer those questions, and we can't if you're in a situation like this. So let's talk about what you need to do instead. Now, instead of just constantly shipping and hoping that you kind of just get lucky by happenstance there, at a moment, at least in the part of the first step here, we want to start to evaluate how well what it is you're shipping is doing in terms of a performance perspective. So as you ship or you build, we want to then take opportunities to measure what the effectiveness was from what we just built and added to the product experience. So along the way and in regular intervals, as you're providing new features for your customers and your users to use in your product, you need to take time to evaluate whether or not those features or components that you've added to your product experience in an ideal world to try to make that better, how has that improved the experience? And if you're taking those opportunities to measure them, you can answer those questions I just talked about. Which ones are being used, which ones aren't, what kind of value are they getting out of it, or maybe they're not, if it's underutilized. So you can really start to get a perspective here on our earlier side of things, what the level of performance is for your current product development process. Now, there's various tools out there that can help you do that as well too. There's a lot of great analytics tools. These are some of the cheaper and or free options here that I've provided that you can incorporate into your product experience right away. Google Analytics, most of us are familiar with, and they continue to try to make that product better. That'll give you more analytics data and detail in terms of better understanding who's logging into your application, the frequency of the daily or monthly active usage. You can get some of that data from these tools. Hotjar is another favorite of mine. I've used it for a lot of my products. They have a great free tier, and in it they do things like screen recordings and provide you with heat maps to get a better understanding and who's using what are they clicking on, and even perhaps something that they're clicking on that isn't linked anywhere, but perhaps maybe it should be. So it can give you good ideas in terms of what to do there as well. And then tools like Hotjar also provide the ability to get survey data back from your customers and users if you're trying to figure out ultimately how can I make this product experience better, or if I've made changes to this application, maybe I can take an opportunity to collect some feedback at this particular point in the product experience. Okay, once you have a better understanding in how well your product development process is performing currently, I want to then talk about what you can start doing to ultimately prevent your boat from taking on water, which is this constant shipping new features and building features, adding them to your product experience without having any idea whether or not it's making the product experience better or worse, or where your threshold is there in terms of how well you're performing. And what I want you to do is I want you to start validating what you're planning on building or adding to your product experience before you build it. That last part is really key here. So as I recommended previously, the first step out of the constant build loop, so to speak, is to start evaluating how well what you've previously built into the product experience has performed. But once you've done that, I wanted you to take that a step further. And that step that I want you to take is related to adding another step to the process. And that's where we ultimately want to be able to better understand what is going to provide value for your users and customers. And the only way you're going to be able to understand that is you're going to need to connect what you're planning to build into your product experience to a specific problem that your user or your customer has that is currently not being solved by your product. That is only going to be done by research and discovery and better understanding the context around the problems and challenges your customers are trying to solve. So instead of just building and evaluating now, or building and measuring, we're going to add a third component. And the third component is going to become the first step in the process. And this is what is going to prevent your boat from taking on water. So again, if you're trying to get from point A to point B and you're trying to do so faster, you're taking on water that's going to slow you down or maybe sink your ship. Instead, we need to cut that off. And we cut that off by evaluating how well you're currently performing, getting a better understanding, ultimately how you need to start fixing it. And you fix that by validating what you're going to build before you build it. That way you can prevent adding any new features to your product experience that are not connected to customer problems. That's the major disconnect, is If what you're intending to add as a feature to your product experience is not connected to a customer problem, they're not going to use it under any circumstances because it just doesn't provide them with value. So it's a relatively straightforward process. It takes some time, it takes some investment, but it is well worth it because at the end of the day, you're not producing those horrible 80 percentage point losses for the vast majority of your product development efforts. So start validating what you want to build before you build it to make sure that any new features that you're going to add to your product experience are going to solve your users and your customers' problems and increase the probability significantly that they're going to use and then get value out of that new feature. Okay, so now that we know how well your product development process is currently performing, what type of return you may be getting, which may not be great, but we figured out the first step in fixing that, which is validating what you're planning to build before you build it and making sure that it's connected to solving customer problems. What I want you to do is I want you to leverage this strategy to now rebuild your product roadmap and backlog by ROI. And I'm going to describe what I mean by that, and these visuals are going to help. So when I say ROI, what I'm talking about is return on investment, as in for anything that you're investing in, realistically, for your entire life, what you ultimately want to do is you want to be able to receive a return for it. As in, if you put $1 into it, I want to make sure you get more than $1 out of it. That would be a positive ROI or positive return on investment. And I'm using that same strategy in order to figure out how to rebuild ultimately your product development process to make sure that your dollars in there are producing more dollars out for you as well. That's the whole purpose of this content that I'm preparing. Now, when it comes to your roadmap, this visual is helping me explain ultimately what we may be trying to make for you from a transformation perspective. As in, and this roadmap can also simulate your backlog in terms of here's what the list is and what you're planning to ultimately build or add into your product experience. Over on the old column is what you may or may not have. In most instances, you probably don't have context related to features you're planning on adding to your product experience and the type of dollar return investment or ROI that you're expecting to get in the product from shipping those features. Now, for any of the context that you don't have, that's where that dash is. So that line that just doesn't have a dollar figure value associated with it. Others listed in there might provide some return, but it might be mediocre, right? You might be generating a return, but that return ultimately may result in a loss. As in, if you're putting $1 in, you might get 50 cents back, which is usually a pretty bad deal. There's going to only be rare instances when that's probably going to make sense. And when we're talking about making investments here, we always want it to make good financial sense. And this is, a lot of product development is not looked at through this lens, but this is how I help a lot of my B2B SaaS clients significantly improve the return that they get from their product development efforts, which is, once fixed as a source, fixes and corrects a lot of other problems. It helps them move a lot faster and helps them get to product market fit a lot quicker. This is what I believe to be one of the single greatest sources of the problems that they experience. But anyway, what we're planning to do is make this transformation for you, where over on the old column for your product roadmap or your backlog, where we don't know ultimately what those features are going to result in from a return perspective in terms of, are they going to improve the product experience? Are they going to provide a positive financial return? We want to convert that from that over to the new column here, where we don't just know that each of the next features that we're planning on building are going to provide a strong return, but each of them is going to do so. And what you're planning to build next is sorted and prioritized by that data, by those metrics. If you know that that's the case, then over time you should be producing a significant return on investment from your product development efforts, and that should make all involved happy. Your customer should get value because ultimately what you're providing to them in terms of an improved product experience is going to be solving their problems, which provides them with value. And your organization should receive a return on that in terms of the performance, the financial performance for your company as well. So that's a roadmap component. Now, I want to talk about what type of an impact that rebuilding your roadmap or your backlog by ROI is expected to have on your team. Now, where you might be at the moment, because if you remember what we were talking about previously, the constant build process that you're likely going through at the moment is ultimately overwhelming your team. As such, we need to figure out a better way in order to get them a significant portion of their time back. So if ultimately what you're building into your product experience is not providing you with a great return, right? Go back to the boat taking on water, then your team probably feels overwhelmed, as in they don't have a lot of time in order to get more out of this process. So you're probably trying to do a lot with little, and it always feels hurried, rushed, teams feel like overwhelmed and burnt out, it's not a recipe for success. It's likely one for failure. So if we're rebuilding our roadmap and our backlog by ROI, what you're going to have the opportunity to do is use essentially a similar metric that I talked about in the beginning, where 80% of what gets shipped into product experience ultimately translates to waste. You're likely going to be able to rip out half, maybe more than half of what's currently in your backlog or currently on your roadmap. Now, what that's going to do is that's going to make your team a lot happier, healthier, and more productive. As in, they're going to get time back because they're not going to be constantly overwhelmed and stuck in this constant build loop. They're just building to build. They don't really have good idea or purpose behind it. So if you're going to be adding this much more value to this process, your team is not going to feel quite as overwhelmed, which is going to free you up to invest in other areas which will provide a greater return and make this process even better. And that gets back to what we talked about here, which is adding a step to that process where we go from just constantly building to building and then measuring to get a better idea into the insight of how well product development is performing at the moment, to providing and ultimately investing in discovery first, to find those problems worth solving, connect solving those problems to the features that you're planning on building next. So when you get that time back for your team, that ultimately is received because you are no longer investing in shipping, good features after bad and etc. Just continually investing into that process. With that time back, that's only going to provide you with the opportunity to ultimately invest in this research and discovery, which is ultimately going to provide kind of that last remaining missing piece to improving your product development process and getting a stronger return from it. All right, so in summary, what I want you to do is, because the vast majority of investment into product development is wasted, I want you to evaluate how well your product development efforts are performing today. Figure out how many of the features that you've been shipping historically have ultimately translated to value for your customer and for your organization. Once you understand what your baseline is, I want you to get focused on figuring out how to make improvements into the product development process. So evaluating along the way to better understand performance, but then ultimately investing into discovery and research to figure out how you can connect what you plan to build next to problems that ultimately need to be solved for your users and customers. And if you are ultimately rebuilding your roadmap and your backlog by ROI, that should free up the kind of space and give your team the capacity to invest even further into this discovery and research effort, thereby continually increasing the return on investment you get into product development. Hey folks, Sean here, and thanks for watching my content. I hope you got value out of it. If you did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel so you can be notified when more content like this becomes available. For those of us out there running B2B SaaS companies that would like to find product market fit faster, I've got a free 5-day email course on it that you can sign up for in the description below. My question for you, which I would love for you to answer in the comment section, is what is the return on investment that you're receiving out of your product development process, and how do you intend on improving it?